Back in the early 1950s, when Australia's vast reserves of uranium first started to be discovered, the then Prime Minister Robert Menzies expressed the hope that these would soon be developed to the vast benefit of all Australians. Almost 70 years on, and many of them have been developed, to the extent that Australia is now the world's third largest uranium exporter. But as with so much else, we'd rather give our uranium to others for them to use than actually make use of it ourselves. There was some talk of using nuclear power in the 1960s and 70s as countries like Britain, France, America and even India developed their nuclear expertise. But nothing came of it. Although we did build a small nuclear reactor at Lucas Heights in Sydney to create the nuclear material widely used for cancer treatment and medical diagnostics. Then in the late 1990s, there was a proposal backed by former Prime Minister Bob Hawke to develop a global nuclear waste storage facility in South Australia. It would have been a great money spinner, and isolation, plus geological and political stability, made it the ideal place. Perhaps surprisingly, it was the Liberals who kiboshed this because they didn't want to face a scare campaign in a state election. And it was the Howard government that agreed on a ban on nuclear power at a federal level in a horse trading to get a bill through the Senate. For a long time after this, the word nuclear was like kryptonite to anyone in politics. But in a bid to revive the state's flagging economy 4 years ago, South Australia's then Labor Premier, Jay Weatherill, announced a royal commission into how his sparsely populated state might profit from developing a nuclear industry. But that got nowhere too, because the Liberals played the predictable anti-nuclear politics. Which brings us to today, where finally there's some sensible voices wanting us as a country to take another look at making good use of the resource we're happy to ship overseas but won't use here. For some time, New South Wales Deputy Premier and Nationals leader John Barilaro has called for a rethink on the nuclear ban. He's now been joined by One Nation's New South Wales leader, Mark Latham, who's gone one step further and now introduced a bill into the state parliament to do just that. Earlier this week, 2 Queensland federal MPs, former electrical engineer Keith Pitt and Senator James McGrath, said they were writing to the Prime Minister in a bid to get a full investigation into how we might utilise nuclear energy here in Australia. And today, in some rare sanity, sponsored by the union-backed superannuation industry, there's a new report saying that we need a nuclear power industry in this country and demolishing repeated claims that renewables as they stand today are the cheapest long-term option for reliable power. Energy Policy Institute Director Robert Pritchard says that we're headed for trouble thanks to more and more unreliable power. He says that backing up a fully renewable energy system for just a day and a half would require 100, that's right, 100 Snowy 2.0 pumped hydro schemes at the cost of an eye-watering $700 billion. Using Tesla batteries, he said, would cost an unimaginable $6.5 trillion. That's trillion dollars. What's needed, he said, to move to a zero net emissions energy system is, and I quote, solar, wind, nuclear in various forms, coal and combined cycle gas generation. Now, as you know, I'm not part of the climate cult, but what mystifies me is how the people who are most worked up about emissions are usually the same people most ferociously against nuclear power, even though it's the only feasible form of emissions-free baseload power for Australia. And we've got massive amounts of uranium here, buried in our country to make it all work. Now, I know that the Morrison government has a lot on its plate as Parliament goes back to work next week. There's the election mandate tax cuts to get through. There's the new law to stop people like John Setka from running unions that Labor must support if Anthony Albanese's leadership is not to fall at the first hurdle. And then there's the US-China trade war, and the threat to oil supplies from Iran that will dominate the Prime Minister's time at the G20. But good governments have to think ahead, and they have to be capable of managing several things at once. A proper consideration of nuclear energy would be something worth reporting to the climate commissars now meeting in Bonn, instead of this rubbish about the correlation between gender policy and climate ideology that's currently occupying the time and effort of our senior officials.